on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
Welcome again. This is the fifth in our lecture series on beauty, and those of you who've been to any of its predecessors will know that what constitutes beauty is certainly not simple, and it's also highly controversial. Well, how much more so? What makes beauty attractive? Our subject is beauty and attraction. In the eyes of the beholder. I looked up, as one does, where the phrase beauty lies in the eyes of the beholder comes from. It turns out it was a phrase coined in 1878 by the Irish equivalent of a Mills and Boon author called Margaret Hungerford. Well, our speaker tonight is very different. It's a pleasure to have Professor Jean Altman. She's a behavioral ecologist of great distinction, Emeritus Professor of Evolutionary Biology at Princeton. She was trained in maths initially at Alberta University before doing her doctoral work at Chicago, where she taught for some years. Professor Altman's formidable international reputation is based on her work for over 40 years studying baboon communities in the wild in Kenya. So the questions are, what do baboons find beautiful? What do baboons find attractive? And what do baboons tell us about ourselves? It's a pleasure to introduce Professor Altman.
The first test is whether I can do this as well as a baboon could. So it's a delight to be here. It was a fascinating invitation, and I was just mentioning to the organizers, my only regret is that I couldn't be here for all the other talks and the ones that are coming ahead. I will not be presenting data slides and so on today. We do have a website, and that not only has our papers but references to others. And what I'll be trying to do is give you a feel for this topic and for explorations. One of the things that was really fascinating about the idea of this talk, and different from other talks, at least as a scientist, is that it was calling out for this integration or interface between science and humanities. And so I'm playing with that a little bit as a preliminary investigation, and trying to ask what seems to be attractive. And in truth, I must confess, we can't ask or have any really good way of otherwise tapping in to say whether that's what the baboons consider beautiful. We can say what we consider beautiful in them, but we judge the sense of beauty to a considerable extent by attraction in this case. So I'm going to start first with a little vignette about intraspecific differences, and how do people view fairly comparable behaviors of different species, and whether they consider it exciting, beautiful, attractive, or not. And these are three of the species out on the East African savannas at the base of Mount Kilimanjaro. And I want you to envision yourself or some other visitors that are traveling to the savannas to observe wildlife. And I know many of you may have had that experience. Here, a pair of baboons is encountered mating. The visitor group, quickly drives away. muttering, perhaps having first covered their children's eyes. Coming upon a ranger or a scientist, the parents splutter their outrage at such X-rated sights. A pair of lions or elephants is encountered. Cameras roll, and if a tour guide is present, he's given an extra tip for such an exciting sighting. A male baboon kills and feeds on the prey, perhaps a gazelle. The visitors recoil. They may even seek a wildlife ranger to complain about the horrible scene that they have witnessed, and can't somebody stop the baboons from doing this terrible thing? A lion kills and feeds on the prey, perhaps a gazelle, wildebeest, or baboon. In the lower left, it's a baboon. Again, cameras roll. More observers are attracted to the awesome sight, delighted to have witnessed one of the highlights of anyone's African safari. When and why are people so variously repulsed, nonplussed, or attracted to ostensibly similar events? Why are sexual or predatory behavior by lions, not by baboons, attractive to many humans? As far as I can tell, the answer lies primarily in our close evolutionary relationship to baboons, closer than to lions and to elephants, and perhaps the consequent embarrassment that comes to watching behavior they would not comfortably watch performed by people. This is simply my hunch. I cannot give you any data on it. I've done lots of informal observations, both in the field and at a major zoo where I often taught my classes in Chicago. I suspect that it's something that's, I know it's something that's very familiar to conservation biologists, who deal all the time with people's differential willingness to work for the survival of some species versus others. Big, very furry, very, what are often called charismatic megavertebrates. But outside the conservation community, there's relatively little attention to these different approaches. And I suspect that a more nuanced and detailed investigation of reactions, of sense of attraction and repulsion and opinions would be revealing of more subtle characteristics and be more broadly applicable to our understanding how our emotions feed into our opinions on a wide range of topics. And this is one more example. The artist Deborah Ross has done a series of baboon drawings and has spent many, many years in East Africa. Most artists, again, sort of just ignore East African artists, of whom there are many, just ignore baboons. So it's not the repulsion aspect that we saw, but an ignoring. On the other hand, who not only does she depict them, but in very, very different way than this advertisement poster for a movie. You'd hardly know it was the same species. And not only for individual baboons, but for the depiction of the society, attacking hordes versus foraging, peaceful living groups. So that is by way primarily to introduce the idea of how variable our reactions can be even to similar behaviors. So for the rest of the talk, I want to zero in and talk about a single species, although the aspects of attraction that I'll talk about have been found in many populations and many other species that have been studied by behavioral ecologists. But we'll focus on savanna baboons, and on these three themes, and not three themes, 6 themes, and I list them as themes, not a sequential outline, because they'll be recurring as we talk about some different aspects. So the first one is the one that we just started with. The second one addresses what senses do we use when we think of something being beautiful. And I know you've already heard about vocal and visual depictions of beauty. And both of those have gotten some attention in biology. But what has much less attention, especially for primates and for humans, are olfactory senses and tactile. And so I'll explore those a bit. And partly raising the idea that does it matter whether we focus on just some senses? Do we come away with very different pictures of attraction, of beauty? And are these the senses that we are most used to talking about, most comfortable with, most aware, maybe even in some cases that are more perfected in humans? But how does that limit our thought about beauty much more broadly in humans and in other taxa, and lead us to perhaps miss attractions that the other species may be attending to? So since for over 40 years, and I've been following, and not I alone by any means, not quite a cast of thousands, but a whole team of Kenyans and Americans primarily, following 7 generations of a baboon family. And they live at the base of Mount Kilimanjaro in southern Kenya. We followed individuals, their mothers, sisters, daughters, and more recently, through genetic analysis that I'll touch on later, fathers and sons as well. We followed them from birth to death for the most part. And I've often wondered, why does she or he have so many friends or mates? Or why not? That's always been a sort of background thing. We've always studied it primarily from a fairly biological, scientific approach. But when one gets to the why not, or why do they, it's easier to answer this one does have many friends than to answer, well, why? What is making this happen? What contributes to it? And are there decisions similar to what yours or mine would be in the same circumstance? And what characteristics, what traits, what senses do they use? And are we limited in knowing by our own sensory capabilities or our attentions? I mean, most scientists come from relatively modern industrial countries where certain things like olfaction just isn't a nice human topic unless you're growing roses in your garden. You don't talk much about, oh, this person smells good. And you may talk about this person smelling bad, but we don't sort of explore that part of our sensory world. Now, we may not be as good as dogs or even as baboons, but we have a lot of olfactory capability, and that is starting to get some research attention. Now, how much are these ideas of who's attractive affected by the changing capabilities of the measurement tools we use? And I'll mention as we go along a couple of examples there where certain changes in technology have opened up our ability to sense sounds at ranges that animals are responding to very elaborately, high or low sounds that we weren't hearing. And so we were cut off from much of what they may be using to decide attractiveness or the opposite. So I'd like you to join me in this exploration, not just in terms of mating and another topic, infant attraction to infants, that have gotten the most attention, but also to friends, to juvenile choice of juvenile partners, friendships among adults, and to think about what senses might contribute to them. So this is where we are, and this is two of our subjects, and I'll give you a little bit of background of baboons before going any further. So baboons are among the largest of the monkeys. Adult males weigh about 25 kilos, and adult females about half that. They live their life about 3 times as fast as we live ours. I know you feel you're living yours as fast as you possibly could. That's what I mean by that is that they spend about 1/3 of the length of time in each life stage as humans do, and that's one way to get a feel for what they're like. But they spend about the same proportion of time in each of these stages. Even though most primates are social, baboons are among the most social, and they live in very cohesive groups in which females are born and spend their whole lives, what's often termed matrilocal. The guys, on the other hand, have the really tough challenge of having to leave. They don't have to leave, but they choose to leave, and in all species, at least one sex disperses. And they spend their adulthood in one or more of other groups. Something that's unusual about baboons, and that's very much like humans, is that they reproduce throughout the year. And that might not be terribly important for our topic, except that it does mean that instead of having a concentrated birth season and having then lots of kids to play with, for example, if you were born in one year, infants are born throughout the year. Also, potential mates are coming and going throughout the year. And so the whole density of experience and the element of choice is very much affected by this lack of seasonality. That's very rare among primates and among many kinds of mammals. And they have a mating system that's polygynandrous. In other words, a male has a number of mates, and so does a female. Because of this, it had long been thought that nobody knew who were the fathers of kids, and that everything matched the matrilines. So, as I mentioned, the females stay in the groups, so that gives them the opportunity to make lifetime friends and to learn the lay of the land, literally and figuratively. But males have this very challenging task of figuring out things anew when they go to other groups. What happens when it's time to mate? And I think I missed something else. Yeah. So this is sort of how our life in the field is. So when I talk about data, you'll have a little feel for that. We, as I was telling somebody just a little while ago, we try to be the most boring primate in the habitat. We were asked, a very good question I was asked, well, do they have preferences among the observers? Who do they like? Who do they find attractive? Who do they think is beautiful? Well, in fact, our research, anyway, can say essentially nothing about that, because we have failed if they're either attracted or repulsed to us, as far as we're concerned. We try, and these are our 3 long-term Kenyan assistants, we try to not only be the most boring primate in the habitat, but also not to take the only shade in the habitat. So there's Raphael out in the sun. We collect data, a variety of means. Here Sarah's using a handheld calculator. And we collect fecal samples to non-invasively investigate steroid hormones, such as stress hormones, which can give a guide to whether a relationship is satisfying and attractive and so on. And also lets Susan Alberts do paternity analysis and lets us now know who the dads are and find out if dads really matter or really don't matter, as assumed. So attraction to a mate can it be very important. It's one of the major topics in evolutionary biology and one of the major topics in the general public about their own lives. And for many species of birds, for example, their color is a major advertisement and attractant. And there are a few primates that are colorful, and some ongoing recent research is finding that things like bright colors and large body size and the displays are probably important in these species, within species, not just between species. But most primates look like this boring baboon. And humans without their clothes are comparably just no match for these flashy guys. Now, of course, we do things like have military uniforms or academic gowns, or we do a huge range of things. The Maasai, who are the pastoralists living in our area, are just awesome in their ability, men and women, of just covering this sort of relatively boring body with bright red and great decoration. Most primates look a bit more like this. So what's a baboon to do? How do they ever look beautiful or attractive to another baboon? Not looking very showy, of course, can be a real advantage when it comes to predation, and can avoid some costly traits. So it's not that that's just a totally independent good. Have baboons and other primates, and perhaps humans, actually developed other senses, or are they more sensitive to the subtle visual differences? We all tell every baboon apart by visual appearance, so they certainly do differ, but it's on a totally different scale than these flashy traits. And one possibility is this greater sensitivity to subtle differences, but maybe it's also combined with other sensory input. One thing one notices is that there is selectivity, and one striking difference in baboons is that although both males and females are boring looking much of the time, females have a very bold advertisement of their reproductive condition, and males definitely pay attention to it. And they don't bother mating with females who are not in a high reproductive condition. Now, contrary to humans, or most humans, it's not the nubile adolescent females who are most attractive. they actually have what most of the human observers consider the more beautiful sex skins, for those of us who do think that some of these sex skins are beautiful. And a sex skin like this is actually about the largest that an adolescent female would ever have. Such females are not of interest to males. In fact, they'll walk up to a male, they're constantly soliciting sexual behavior, and they will virtually stick their rear end in a male's face, and the male just goes like this. I've had many guys say to me, well, but it would be so easy. I mean, why not? But they don't. I can't answer that question. Courtney Fitzpatrick, who's been studying what is attractive, are these much more what many of us would consider not only exaggerated but gross, but maybe don't. We won't take a vote on that. Sex skins. These are the sex skin swellings that get the most attention from the males, and these are the peak swellings that occurred when Courtney now knows on the cycle that a female conceived. So here we have a trait that might be in many ways similar to something comparable in humans, and we have a different sense of what's attractive. Also, baboon males and a large number of primate males are only interested in mature, proven females, not these sweet young things. Go figure. So, particularly experimental studies in field settings are making possible not only a naturalistic setting, but a setting that lets various experimental advantages being taken. And one of these differences is the kind of improvement in recording equipment, both in studies of very low sounds with elephants, all sorts of worlds of interaction and attraction at very long distances that observers couldn't identify before have been identified through what are now much smaller and more powerful field playback, recording and playback settings. And this has two characteristics. One, it's a technological change that's made a huge difference in a field that otherwise is still very much sort of trucking around the savannas doing what one does. But it's also was made possible and driven by very intuitive, sensitive observers who were feeling, they had been observing elephants for years, they were feeling some like roughness and in the ground, some physical sense of change, but not hearing anything. And they suspected this long-distance communication, this low responsiveness was going on. The elephants were attending, and sure enough, it turned out by combining this human sensitivity and attentiveness with some technology, much was found. In studying rodent vocalizations at the high end, the same has been found as well. And the red deer studies out of the UK are a marvelous example, again, of using of playback experiments. Well, in addition to reproduction, to mating, one of the other major things, once you produce kids, if you're going to be successful, you've got to get them through the stage of infancy and into a safer stage. So there's been much attention to the fact that throughout primates, there's a lot of interest in infants. And what happens is that as soon as an infant's born in this closed group, imagine you're one of 50 animals that travel together all the time, and a new infant is born, and almost everybody comes up and inspects that infant touches it, they're attracted to it. If the mother isn't too high-ranking, or they'll go right up and they'll pull up the infant, and inevitably they look at the genitals. It's just like going into a playground with a new infant, you know. What is it, a boy or a girl, right? First thing people want to know. I was sure when I studied infants that this would lead to differential attention to the two sexes. No indication at all. Apparently, they're just curious. They're getting lots of olfactory input. They're getting lots of visual input. Whether they store it away for later, I don't have any idea. But with all this attention for infants, it's not that they then start just treating the boys one way and the girls another way. We just don't know. Now, infants are cute. That seems to be very commonly agreed to. What I don't have time today is to show you, my student has manipulated this picture of an infant the way a lot of studies of responses to human infants. What makes us say that a baby is beautiful? What makes people attracted to it? And it turns out in humans that some well-known traits of how big the eyes are, how round the face is, and then things like symmetry. You might have noticed this asymmetry in this face. Even early in life, getting a few knocks and bruises. This youngster may be considered particularly attractive by the baboons. We have tended to consider them, but we have actually no idea whether, with all this attention to infants, whether by sex, gender or not, whether they are differentially considered attractive by others. So one of the things about this initial attraction, though, may be a general attention to infants and care for them in a group. There are some species of primates that, like humans, have a fair bit of care and attention by individuals other than their mothers. Mothers are the primary caretakers. I'm not going to tell you any story of liberated females. But the attention and knowledge of all these infants may be very important in infants' survival. And is thought, Sarah Hrdy recently wrote a fascinating book on basically the point of how much communal caregiving goes on, overt and covert, in human societies, and how essential it is to survival. The roots of that are seen in non-human primates. So beyond the attraction to mates and infant, is that it? Those are two big highlights of evolutionary biology and of many individuals' lives. And it's not surprising for both scientific and personal reasons that they have gotten so much attention. But most primates, including those of us, most of us here, I assume, spend relatively little of our lives as vulnerable infants or trying to attract new mates. So do attractions occur outside these two big contexts and during most of the rest of their lives, rather than in these relatively short bursts? Well, it turns out that they do, and that we're gaining a rich understanding of some of the ways that they do. Now, at Mattingly here at Cambridge, the study of friendships, of social relationships, has a long and rich history and stimulated a lot of the research starting in the 50s and 60s on this topic in captive animals in particular. Long-term studies, such as ours and the dozen or so around the world on other populations and species, have begun to be able to tease out these relationships and these preferences. Do individuals just do a lot of socializing in a sort of generic way, or do they, like we, have particular individual attractions? And here, too, technology has aided this long-term observational interest, because I showed Eukinua Waruteri collecting samples for genetic analysis. For the first time, we know who dads are and who paternal sisters, for example, versus maternal sisters are. And that really gives a totally different picture of what the social relationships are in a society. So among playmates, when given a choice, studies of monkeys and of humans, but in monkeys in captivity primarily, and humans in a very modified environment that most of our children live in, they choose like-aged and like-sex playmates. However, if most wild primates put up their nose to playing with a younger kid or a girl if they're a boy, they'd have nobody to play with. Remember I mentioned that reproduction throughout the year? There would be no one to do. So both in playmates and among adults in choosing friends and associates that way, there are these priorities that have been seen when the density of possible individuals to associate with are very high. But it seems that these friendships, these associations, are so important in the lives of the animals that they don't forego playing and they don't forego adult positive relationships. What are those positive relationships? Well, hopefully many of you have had a chance to see monkeys at the zoo or even out in the wild, and you know that they do a lot of grooming, or many species do, and baboons do. It's sort of like getting a good massage, or when women plait each other's hair and do it up. It's hand-on, it's tactile. This turns out to be an extremely important part of their lives. And we're studying the consequences from an endocrine standpoint of having more friends, longer standing relationships. And we don't know the answer to that yet, but several studies have shown that, in fact, females who have more friends, closer friends, particularly measured by this grooming, but just hanging out together, the equivalent of everybody sitting and knitting, or the guys having a few beers with each other. These are the major ways that differential attraction plays out. The females who have these greater friendships, their youngsters, their infants, are more likely to survive. In addition, it's been found in one study that the females themselves will live longer. And this is controlling for all sorts of things like dominance hierarchies and other things that might affect what these kinds of results are. So being attracted and being attractive may have some very practical real-life benefits as well. In all of these, there's very little known about the olfactory contribution. But we know that in a large number of settings, both visual and olfactory cues probably come into play. And the visual cues are probably often the behavioral ones, at least as much as as any physical traits. Why do humans in our societies not attend to the olfactory ones so much? I don't know how many of you have a similar experience to mine, where when I was growing up, my grandfather had a little coffee importing and roasting store in Greenwich Village in New York. Visiting my grandparents was always associated with the aroma of roasting coffee. Some of you may have some different aromas associated with that. And when I, in turn, had children, all the little baby sweaters my grandmother knit came in packages that immediately I knew they were grandma, they were grandpa. Those are part of my sensory reactions. There are groups of Australian Aborigines that, when traveling through different areas, territories, and going in, bringing somebody new into their own territory, anoint them with bodily odors of familiarity. Growing up in Maasai land, the Maasai, of course, do all this ornamentation and use not just the beautiful red coloration, but red coloration that comes with the smell of the fats and the colorants that they use. When my son got married, people from the community sent me back with all sorts of wedding gifts that they made. And when my son got the package, his first reaction was, before he saw anything in it, was, ah, Maasai. So we have these occasions, and I would guess that at least many of you have those, but we don't include them in our sensory decision making. Recently, in a less happy situation, there was a report of the last Christian tending the last church in some remote Iraqi village. And he said he couldn't, everybody was trying to get him to leave. There was no community there anymore. And he said he couldn't leave. He remembered Christmas celebrations in the garden at Mary, Queen of Peace Church, staying up all night with his Muslim neighbors, both Arabs and Kurds. This is history for us, he said. I can still smell my friends here and my family here. Many friends now say I should leave, that they have work for me where they are, but I can't leave the church. So I think that attraction for humans too may have much more of the olfactory as well as the tactile. And it's interesting because both the olfactory and the tactile are very much close at hand sources. Sound and vision can often be over much greater distances than olfaction and tactile. And as in many of our interactions now, and as we move into a future where we can even see each other on Skype now, but we don't yet have olfactory components, and we can't groom each other over Skype, one wonders at the consequences of the changing range of inputs and options in deciding about beauty and attraction. In each of the examples of attraction that I've mentioned, we've made progress, what progress we have made, and we have much more to do, by an interplay of the scientific method, technological advances, and the intuition, the feeling for the organism, and imagination that the human mind brings to them. And I think that the more we can do that, moving between our experience, not rejecting any one of these sources of progress, and move into increasing areas in which we begin to imagine and other possibilities, other senses, other ways of knowing and attracting, then we will both learn much more, and we may learn more about ourselves as about other species. Thank you.
Well, I think we ought to start by thanking 7 generations of baboons for informing this research. It is fascinating how our conception of beauty is constrained by our limited sense ranges, and the thought that all this Skyping and the rest of it might be limiting our sensitivity to each other even more is I find, a rather chastening thought. It's been a wonderful account of, if not the beauty of baboons, bottoms and babies, at any rate the attractiveness of them, apparently, to baboons, and the importance of this attraction for survival, a thing that if you've ever had teenage daughters in the house, you've never doubted. But the extent to which we do get insights into the essentially human-oriented and very limited notions of beauty by looking at baboons is, I think, absolutely fascinating. And for a really lovely talk, thank you very much, Professor Altman.